for this talk today, I'm talking about something that is, you're studying data science and no doubt exploring the big data ecosystem comes to mind a lot, which is, this is a place where there's so many technologies, many of them named after animals, right? So, I thought the idea that it's when you think about what technologies are succeeding and what ones are important, and as you think about in your career, where do I invest my time in trying things and working with things, it's important to have a lens around this fascinating open source ecosystem that we're part of, and some really new trends to understand what things are important, are going to matter, and which ones are maybe not worth the time, right? So, and the thesis, it's not the beast, it's the herd, is the first fundamental principle, which is it's a lot less important in some way to look at a single thing, a single technology, a single thing, than how it fits together with an ecosystem with a number of other things, right? In almost any technology space, certainly true in the case of big data. So we'll talk a little bit today about a few things. One, I'll tell you a little bit about me, kind of why I'm giving this talk. So I've had the good fortune to lead big data engineering and data science teams for over 8 years, working with Hadoop and NoSQL and MPP databases. Started doing that at a company called QuantCast, the pioneer that was measuring the internet, went on to build a real-time lookalikes model to scale advertising on the internet, and left that to start Think Big, to provide big data services to the enterprise about 5 years ago. So in those 5 years, we've worked with mostly large enterprises, but also innovative startups and everything in between, grown-up startups like Facebook. So I've had a lot of opportunities to live through many generations. And in fact, before that, I've been involved in open source business models. Back in the late 90s, I left the entrepreneurship program, or left the PhD program at MIT after leading a team to the entrepreneurship competition finals to start a company that became Seabridge, which was doing, again, services around Internet 1.0, helping the enterprise use that. And that was an era when open source was really starting to have an impact in the enterprise. Things like Linux were emerging that were impacting what had been previously a much more commercial ecosystem. So we've been through a number of generations of big data, and I want to share with you a little bit about our experience. So the first thing is, as you can see, this is a small number. This is just a few that came to mind of interesting big data technologies that you might think about. There's hundreds, right? There's many, many open source projects for big data. And many open source projects, right? I mean, you don't have to go into GitHub and look at how many millions of open source projects there are out there, right? So there's a lot of them out there, right? And as we all know, many are called, but few are chosen, right? There's a handful like this. This is a chart. This is also a clue, a thing that I think is really helpful when you think about, is a technology gaining traction? Is it meaningful? There's this great site, Indeed.com. Who's familiar with Indeed.com? So their main business is they post ads for jobs. But the thing they do that's kind of cool is they've done the statistics on what keywords are trending in our job ads, right? So you can see that the top job trends on Indeed, number 2 is MongoDB, and number 7 is Hadoop. I'm not quite clear why Hadoop is trending less. When you look, it seems to be scaling it even a little faster than Mongo. But regardless, the point being that there's a handful of things that really get traction, that get a lot of adoption, that become meaningful, right? But it's also, in addition to using this to illustrate that few are chosen, that these are some winners among the many options that are out there. Puppet's also open source. And jQuery, this is a tool that is helpful when one thinks about how do I even know if a technology is getting some traction, right? Looking at job trends, because people talk a lot about technologies, but if someone's actually hiring for that technology, it means that there's a different level of commitment to it than simply, hey, I'm excited about this thing, and someday it might matter, right? So why, right? I mean, I think fundamentally, there's a tipping point phenomenon that goes on here, that you've got certain technologies get a certain level of interest and attraction, and then there's a strong viral effect that people start talking about with another, and if playing with it, and if they like it, they share it with friends, right? So a great example, actually, right before Hadoop even emerged, right, when Google was pioneering a lot of the basic ideas of big data, they came up with MapReduce as a programming paradigm. And that chart there is from the original MapReduce paper. And it shows how MapReduce tipped very dramatically in Google, that people found lots of great ways of things they could use MapReduce to program, where before it was much harder to build a distributed system, and so people didn't bother, right? So that's the illustration of how, MapReduce tipped. It was a tremendously powerful idea, and so you've seen similar phenomenon time and time again, right? When you get something that works, that you've got that fit, people get excited, and it gets adoption, right? So people like to share it, and it really works in a good way. Well, one of the things I think is underlying this is the open source phenomenon. The guy on the right, for the 1% of you who may not know, is Loomis Torvalds, right? So if you're a hotshot 18-year-old programmer, who do you want to be when you grow up? You probably want to be Linus, right? He's a rock star. I mean, he's created the most important operating system in the world, and he was the leader of that from a young age, right? So there's lots of brilliant young programmers who are out there trying to make their name in open source, right? Because you don't have to, the bar is low. You can just start working on it, and if you rise to the top through meritocracy, and of course, what 18-year-old doesn't know that they're the best programmer in the world, right? They've been pretty good so far. They've been hacking some great things, right? So there's a lot of excitement, and a lot of young programmers, toil away. Maybe they have a day job, but they're working on open source at night, right? So you've got so many projects out there because there's so many young engineers trying to do this. And I think the closest analogy of this is people who are young and want to get into entertainment going to Hollywood in the hopes of becoming an actor. However, the difference is, at least the day job for these people can be, they're getting paid pretty well as a programmer instead of waiting tables. So there's a little less downside, there's a little more staying power, right? So that's one factor. Another thing that I think is a big factor in deciding, which technologies are going to win, something that is newer, is that you're now seeing significant monetization of open source, right? So, the classic kind of the early successes of open source were entirely community driven by people solving a problem they had and sharing it. Now, I'll tell you that in the big data world, the first wave of innovation was the same way, right? So Google made some stuff that worked for them, and that it worked. And then basically their competitors, people like Yahoo, said, that's a good idea what they did. I like that paper. Why don't we support it, sponsor it, get it working in open source? So the classic example of user innovation, right? So they built it for their own needs, and they ended up sharing with like-minded organizations and building a community. But very quickly, what had happened is you'd had, in the last decade, some meaningful open source successes. Red Hat had been very successful in the Linux market. You'd had MySQL and JBoss as prominent examples, Spring Source, of open source companies that had been managed to exit for hundreds of millions of dollars selling to other companies. So you had a lot of excitement and a lot of investment, right? So what you see here, this is a chart of millions of dollars raised by open source companies. I mean, Cloudera is out there on the left at 1.2 billion, but you've got Hortonworks with their IPO now at over 300 million and on down the line, right? There's a lot of money going at this, and that's just startups, right? Then you look at larger companies, right? And you look at the investments that, not just Teradata is making, but Oracle, IBM, Cisco, right? I mean, you've got a massive amount of money from industry flowing into open source, right? So you've got, that's always a factor in saying, well, is this technology going to be successful, right? Is there backing for it, right? Is there a team? Is there a dedication? Is there a way that we can be confident this thing is going to move forward, right? There are some successful communities that happen in spite of funding, but it's more and more that open source is being driven by the money that's flowing into it. So that's an important factor. And the other thing is, I think is really important in saying, well, is a technology going to succeed, is this bigger question of, again, the herd, the ecosystem, or the community, right? And one thing I thought was interesting, another way of getting a sense of, well, what is the community of something, is taking a look at dependencies of it in the broader community, right? So for Java-based technologies, as most Hadoop-based things are, you can go out to the Maven repository, the iBiblio, and they have a nice web interface. And you can see here the difference between Hadoop core, where you've got 325 other things that depend on that are registered inside of it, down to something more obscure. Crunch is a programming environment for MapReduce, and there's about 13 things that depend on it, right? So you can see Spark, we'll talk more about Spark later, but Spark's got a lot of excitement out there, but not as many dependencies, right? So not as much open source is actually building on it. So that's one gauge of, you don't just have to sort of be intuitive and say, well, I think there's a lot going on around this community. You can actually go out there and look at some direct measurements to say that. Now, what's not easy to do, which would be really cool, is something more like PageRank, right? So rather than just a count, like I don't know do any of these 13 projects matter, right? But if an important project depends on you, that's a lot more important than an unimportant one, right? So I assume people here know how PageRank works, so same idea could be applied in this space too, right? So that takes a little bit of intuition. So but back to community, I think it gets back to, again, one of the things that's so fascinating about what's going on in the big data world vis-a-vis open source is, Eric S. Raymond wrote a great essay about 25 years ago called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, where he analyzed why open source works and how this messy collaboration without anybody organizing it ends up being more successful than highly designed commercial efforts, right? The cathedral, right? And I've read the essay, I must confess. Now he's written a book. I felt like I should probably show the book here. I haven't read it, but I love the essay. So it's really good to read about. It talks a lot about, again, what I would think of as open source 1.0, pure community-driven open source. And what I think is really interesting, though, with all that money flowing into the big data ecosystem now, you've got some weird hybrid of the cathedral and the bazaar, right? You've got still community involvement, but you've now got a lot more of the classic forces of top-down control, and people are being paid to go out and do something. So you've got an interesting hybrid happening around open source between those two polar extremes, right? So open source is evolving just as commercial software is evolving, right? I mean, I think it's incredible. I always like to say, if you think it's hard to make money on an open source business model, try competing against one, right? So, it's become very hard for people to compete in the open source ecosystem without having a strong open source foundation in the big data space. Another thing is, a basic truth that I think is proven out time and again. This is Gartner's hype cycle for emerging technologies. And if you haven't seen it, it's really important to understand. This is a very common trend. Now, not every technology makes its way through this, right? Some technologies die before they ever become mainstream, but the ones that do inevitably go through these phases, and pretty much any technology that gets some traction starts off with some trigger. It could be done. This peak of inflated expectations. It's going to solve world peace. It's going to be the answer to everything. Then a trough of disillusionment is, one, people realize it doesn't do everything, and two, the trough is always exacerbated by everybody who's doing anything remotely related to it says, this is a great way for me to sell my stuff. I'm going to pile on, and I'm going to say I'm involved with this. And those things don't work and disappoint people. And eventually people come to the slope of enlightenment. Hey, I kind of figure out what this is actually good for, and I get to a plateau of productivity. Now, what I think is interesting is in big data is such a big movement that it's actually got pieces going in each of these, right? So I agree with Gartner from last year that big data was on its way down, and Hadoop with it down here. But meanwhile, guess what's happened? We've had a few entrants coming up here. Currently, right around here is Spark. Spark is absolutely at the peak of inflated expectations right now as a technology that can do no wrong. We've seen this. We're talking with customers about, we have some interesting technology to do fast, OLAP type analysis, reporting and aggregations in Hadoop, and Spark has nothing to do with it, but customers are so excited about Spark and it can do everything, but doesn't Spark solve that problem? Right, so that's where something's at the peak of inflated expectations. I think it's interesting though, because thinking about that effect, what's kind of nice is, as things are continuing to generate hype, it's taking away from some of the worst elements of the backlash down here around big data and letting it move more quickly, I think, into some enlightenment that the things that are more established are being used and can be applied while people are getting excited about the next thing, right? So we're getting crashing waves of hype in big data, which is a unique phenomenon in my perspective. But this nature of technology adoption is common. And so if you see a technology that's doing real good things, but it's down here, you can't lose hope. That's one important message. Today, if you look at it, you can see that there's a whole lot of different technologies out there. There's some of the ones we're going to talk about today in a little more depth. I want to unpack some of these ideas and give some examples of interesting open source technologies and explore kind of what's working or what did or didn't work. Right? You can see quite a range. Hadoop having strong interest. You can see Spark has just rocketed up. A lot of people looking for it in jobs. That often means that they may not actually be using it, but boy, if somebody had it, they'd like to have that, right? And so it goes, right? You can see the NoSQL databases down there, and then you look at Impala as something that hasn't really taken off in the same way as an example of a technology that's out there in the open source ecosystem. It's also interesting because one other thing about open source, right? There's two poles, right? There's community open source, or the classic bazaar, and then there's single vendor, highly controlled open source, right? And there's been a lot of highly controlled open source over the years. MySQL was done that way. JBoss was done that way. Impala is an example of a single vendor open source technology that's really not in the community. On the other hand, when you look at the Apache Foundation, you look at the strategy of a company like Hortonworks, their strategy is to control the community, right? So it's an interesting hybrid, right? That it's not a community of, well, there's lots of people participating. It's we're paying people so that we can dominate the community, but others can play too, right? And of course, you've got Cloudera started playing that game, so you've got this wrestling match in the Apache Foundation between the two of them and other parties trying to take control of important projects and steer them in their direction. So, with Hadoop, it's a foundation. I really think Google came up with some great ideas, as I talked about. Hadoop came along, and the right idea at the right time, implementing this idea of a distributed file system and just MapReduce programming, which the thing that's interesting about MapReduce is that it's simple. It's a simple technology that lets you do some things really well. You can solve distributed programming problems with it in a way that doesn't solve everything, but it means you can make it much easier to do something. Right? So it's generated a lot of excitement. I think the innovation around having data replicated and allowing you to work on commodity hardware and have reliability in the software layer, so things would keep processing when stuff broke at scale, was a real innovation. Until then, everyone tried to build distributed systems by building highly reliable components that would never fail, and that just doesn't scale. Right? So it's been a foundation. And you look at Yarn. Yarn, I don't know if people are familiar with Yarn, but it's a system that lets you run a lot of different things for Hadoop, not just MapReduce. And that's really opened the floodgates to the herd, right? So you've got a lot of different technologies. We'll touch on a few of them. I like to point this one out, Zookeeper. Who's heard of Zookeeper? Okay, good. A lot of people have heard of it. It's distributed coordination. It's a small component. It's under the covers. If you're technical, you've undoubtedly run into it. You may have run into some problems with it at some point. But the point is, before Zookeeper, Hadoop really didn't have this kind of capability, and you had things like single point of failure for the name node for distributed files in Hadoop. Since it's come out, people have used it to build high availability coordination across all kinds of components. So it's incredibly widely used and incredibly baked into the foundation of Hadoop, and it's used outside of Hadoop. Things that are very different projects even are starting to adopt it because it's so effective for that. So it's a very successful project, even though it's not kind of a top line. Now you look at Hive. Who's familiar with Hive? Right, so Hive is a great example, right? Facebook realized that they wanted a higher level language than Java for programming their Hadoop clusters, for accessing the data in it, and they came up with a SQL variant. So Hive is first rev of SQL for Hadoop. It's very batch-oriented traditionally. Right? It was optimized for throughput and scanning large amounts of data. And if you've ever sat in front of a Hive command line waiting for a simple query to return after 2 minutes, you'll testify that that's not ideal. Now there's work to improve it, but architecturally it's still not ideal for an interactive query environment. And that's led to things like Impala and Presto, right? Cloudera has been backing Impala for a long time. Facebook built the next gen with Presto, right? So you've got some new things there. What's going on with that? I think Impala is very much this test of, can you have a single vendor controlled open source product solving a problem can that succeed? Or are you going to have more of a community-based approach, whether it's a Hive or a Presto or some combination where you've got multiple participants? In fairness, Presto today doesn't have a lot of adoption, but it does have one other thing, right? This is, in terms of good code quality, the other thing I think it's got that's very interesting is proof at scale. You know, there's an analogy, an earlier open source battle, Cloudera created Flume for streaming data into Hadoop clusters, and it was never that great. It didn't scale that well. A lot of, you know, patching and trying to get it to there, whereas Kafka got designed very cleanly at LinkedIn and solved that problem at scale, and now is taking over. So, you know, the quality really matters, right? Spark, well, I'd be remiss in not touching on Spark, both because it's so exciting, because its origins are right here at UC Berkeley, right? The AMP lab folks created it, and you know, I think it's another example that one of the things that's really helped Spark is it was started out simple, but it had high quality code, and they've been iterating and improving on it rapidly. So, you know, the growth in community, and sometimes I think the ambitious set of projects they're taking on are a little bit much. I think the interesting challenge around Spark as it gets adoption is the people who created Spark spun out a company called DataBricks to commercialize it. But they couldn't follow the path of the Clouderas and so forth of saying, well, we're going to try to sell it, support for a distribution, because that was sort of taken, that Cloudera and others are actually adopting Spark and trying to take it over, right? So they either could compete with Cloudera to out Cloudera the Cloudera, or they ended up saying, well, we'll just do a cloud model, right? There's a lot of thinking about how do you build open source companies, and saying open source companies probably look more like GitHub in future, where you have a web service that adds value on top of the open source, right? So they're trying to do that. A lot of questions in my mind whether the market timing is right for that one. But Spark is certainly solving some important problems, and when you look at machine learning for Hadoop, it's, you know, every major project around machine learning is now adopting Spark, and most of the BI tools for Hadoop as well. So I think Spark is going to be a winner, even if there's a lot of excitement. Cascading is interesting too, because it's probably the first framework for higher level programming in Hadoop on top of MapReduce. Started in 2007, and it's never really gotten a lot of traction. A little bit of traction at some startups, a few engineering-oriented firms. And I think it's a great example of, you know, there are some good ideas in it, but it just never took off, maybe because of its complexity. It didn't quite have the community, didn't have the level of abstraction people were looking for. But it's an example of, you know, you could have something that has a lot of good qualities and doesn't go anywhere. So, you know, we obviously don't have time in this short talk to handicap or talk through at any great length the NoSQL shootout, but you know, you've got many NoSQL databases. These are the leading ones, and some of what each of them bring to the table, right? I think there again, you've got trying to guess who's going to win in NoSQL is challenging, but you know, there's a few obvious leaders with meaningful traction in each of their in their own segment or community. So, you know, stepping back from this, I think the thing is, as we think about, well, how do you know if something, an open source project is going to work, right? I mean, the first thing I'd say is, does it have an active development going on, right? So if you look at an open source project, you should see activity that people are still committing code or checking it in. When Nathan Mars left Twitter to start a stealth startup, I took a look and noticed he's not checking stuff into to Storm anymore. That's a bad sign, right? In fact, it turned out Twitter folks rewrote Storm after that. You know, the core of it, right? What's the pedigree? What kind of people are involved? Are they impressive? You know, is it enough of a core team? It doesn't have to be a lot of people, but a few good people working on it. What's the community like? Are there users? Is there an active set of forums? Is there dialogue around this stuff? Are bugs getting fixed? Are bugs being reported, right? What's the viability, right? What support and backing does this project have? If it's a small component, it might be that, you know, one person working part-time is a great strategy, but if it's trying to take over as the foundation, in fact, this was the thing that held Spark back before DataBricks spun out and before Cloudera and others backed it, was you had, you know, grad students here, you know, trying to build a platform, and it wasn't a credible backing for something. You know, people didn't feel like there was the commercial foundation they could trust it. What's the competition, right? Is it if something is good, but they've got better competition, they're probably going to lose, right? And what's the trajectory? How is it trending? Right, so these are all important things to think about when you think about, is this an open source technology that I want to use that's going to be successful? So in conclusions, I think the fact that big data is really the first wave of innovation that's being led by open source. Until now, innovations have been done in commercial software, and open source has come in to commoditize, to standardize, to follow on. But that's not the case here, right? So all the interesting case studies for business schools in the next decade are being written right now around what happens when you have open source lead innovation. It's evolving, right? The very fact that it's now taking center stage is changing the game, right? And it's really important to understand hype versus reality and have an objective set of lenses to think about what are the technologies that I should bet on. So with that, appreciate your time, and I don't know if we have time for a question or. Okay.
Thank you.